Welcome to the Sports Ethicist Show, coming to you from the basement of Burpee on the campus of Rockford University in Sportstown, USA, Rockford, Illinois. I am Sean Klein, the Sports Ethicist. The Sports Ethicist Show discusses the many ethical and philosophical issues that arise in and around sport. You can read the Sports Ethicist blog at sportsethicist.com, where you can also download podcasts of previous shows, subscribe to the podcast, or find links to related information. The Sports Ethicist is also on Facebook and Twitter. You can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. So this is a busy time on the sports calendar. Hockey and basketball playoffs are in full swing. NFL draft is going on, right? Well, not as we speak, but over these couple days. Baseball's really getting going, really starting to heat up out of its sort of April slumbers, and it's really starting to get going. You have the European Soccer Championships this month in the different various European leagues and the Champions League. It's also the season of the Triple Crown in horse racing. So I thought that would be a fun thing to talk about. It started with the Kentucky Derby, which was run last Saturday, and California Chrome won that. Next weekend is the Preakness. And then 3 weeks after that is the Belmont in June. So horse racing raises several interesting ethical and philosophical issues. And to discuss some of these with me is biology professor here at Rockford University, Sean Beckmann. Welcome back to the show, Sean.
Thank you for having me.
Like many professional sports, doping and safety are two of the biggest moral issues that come up. So I thought we could start with talking a little bit about some of the safety issues in horse racing, particularly as it concerns the general welfare of the horse. So now you are, what do we call it? A mammalogist?
A mammalogist.
A mammalogist, yes. Right? And so horses are mammals. I know that. Is the horse racing and the horse running at the speeds that it runs, is that a natural movement for an animal like the horse?
Definitely so for the horse, probably more than almost any other mammal. Horses are adapted for that lifestyle. I mean, if you look at it from a very basic biomechanics perspective, the smallest amount of area you put down on the ground, the biggest amount of rebounding force you're going to get. You know, for every action, there's an equal but opposite reaction. So horses are adapted for running because they're basically putting, when you look at a horse foot, it's actually the tip of a toe that touches the ground, basically straight down, getting an equal spring back force from the ground, the hoof itself. Yeah. The smaller that surface area and the smaller the amount of material that contacts the ground, the more direct down and upward force you're going to get. So the more effective recoil you get from the ground. So horses are literally designed to run. That is their function. They have one toe, and that toe touches the ground, and that limb has been lengthened over the course of evolutionary time dramatically. So that, I mean, when we look at what we would think to be, you know, the elbow or the knee of a horse, what we're really looking at is basically the wrist of that thing. So they're designed for speed. They're designed to run. Now, how much horse racing as a sport has kind of taken advantage of that and has used it much more than these animals would in nature, that's a different story. And that definitely puts, to some extent, a strain.
So they do run naturally in the wild. I mean,
absolutely.
I don't know what the wild population of horses are
it's
across
pretty small in the U.S. these days.
Yeah. I think somewhere somewhere in Africa, an island or something like that, where there's a lot of wild horses.
There's some Asian wild horses. There's some in Africa as well. They're definitely much more common in the other side of the world than they are here in the U.S. Most wild horse populations.
Well, because they're not native to. No, they're not a native species. But the hoof is similar to like gazelles and things like that in terms of the design, the manufacturing.
Yeah, except even more so. When we look at gazelles and other animals like them, they're what are called artiodactyls. They have an even number of toes. So they have two toes, 2 or 4, depending on what we're talking about. In horses, it's actually reduced even more that they only have one toe. So they've literally gotten as small of a number of toes
Okay.
as you can get to make contact with the ground.
Okay, so they're built to run pretty. And now, so then the question is, okay, so there's running, and then there's sprinting at top speed, right? And how often are they doing that? And then I guess the frequency with which they're running. I mean, I would imagine that if there was evolutionary pressure for them to evolve in the way that they've evolved, to have those limbs as they have, that they must run in the wild a lot from predators and whatnot, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, the easiest example to look at is a zebra. A zebra is a horse species. Zebras run, but mostly they're running to avoid predators, to get away from predators. So yeah, they're running, and sometimes they're running long distances. They're definitely running at fast speeds, but it's if they're running at top speed, it's over relatively short periods of time.
Okay.
And it's presumably intermittent. It's not repeatedly running at top speed for a few minutes at a time and then doing it again and then doing it again and doing it day in and day out in a training scenario like we would have with domestic thoroughbred horses.
Right. Now, and of course, the thoroughbreds are bred. It's in the name to do this. So, how much of the husbandry, the breeding that's gone on has accentuated these sort of running characteristics versus what you might find in a, I don't want to say more normal, but one of the wild horses that you might find, assuming that they're not just feral thoroughbreds or something, but that they're actually a wild population that hasn't been influenced by human breeding.
You definitely have seen modification on that. I mean, there's definitely been and continues to be, quote unquote, artificial selection in thoroughbred horses, in horse racing. The horses that are the fastest and are winning the races are the ones that get studded out to produce offspring that are then going to be used to run and win races. And so you take what was once a very large population and you reduce it down to a very small gene pool over a short period of time. I mean, I don't know the numbers by any means, but I'd imagine most thoroughbred racing horses could probably trace their lineage back to very, very few ultimate parental individuals.
So they're all close cousins.
Yeah, exactly. And, coming with that, you get, longer legs, more specific muscle fiber types, certain proportions. And then there becomes a limit on that where you hit an anatomical point where you can only select so much before you've hit the point of physical restraint. The organism can't go any further because of anatomical restraints, and you hit the ideal, quote unquote ideal. And that's kind of where we are with horse racing today. Yeah. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers, the Derby's been run, Kentucky Derby has been run at its current, length since 1896. Well, in 1897, the winning time of the Derby was 2 minutes and 12.5 seconds. In 1950, so approximately 50 years later, and yes, I'm cherry picking my numbers a little bit here, but the winning time was 2 minutes and 1.6 seconds. That's about an 11-second drop over the course of about 50 years. That's pretty decent. I mean, that's about 0.2 of a second per year we're seeing on average. Since 1950, that's basically flattened out to the point that this year, the California Chrome, the winning time was 2 minutes and 3.6 seconds. It was actually 2 seconds higher than it was 64 years ago. Yeah. And there's some fluctuation around that, but it's basically flat since 1950. Since 1950, we've basically had the ideal horse to run the Kentucky Derby, and the anatomy of the animal keeps us from selecting for a horse that really can get any better than that without some sort of artificial means. Right, and
we'll get to that. What else besides the limbs? Because, from watching the Nature Channel and things like that, and they have the cheetahs and the gazelles and stuff. So is there, the way that their lung space and diaphragm, the way the breathing works, is that something that horses are well adapted for running the way, as I understand it, gazelles and cheetahs? That's one of the reasons why they can run as they can for such distances, is because they can breathe in a way that facilitates that. Are horses selected that way?
Absolutely. And if we, a big part of it, of course, is simple biomechanics. You've got limb length. Simple biomechanics, but you've got limb length there, and you've got where the joints are and the proportions of them relative to body size. Then you get into the whole concept of, muscle fiber and different fiber types, which you and I have talked about before on here.
Uh-huh.
But then certainly respiration.
Which I keep thinking about when I'm in the gym. I was like, I should be doing heavier weights now to be working, to be tiring my, is it the slow twitch?
The fast twitch.
The fast twitch first and then the slow twitch. Yeah.
Build up muscle size.
Yeah. I need to do that. So.
But respiration plays a huge role in this. I mean, the more oxygen you can get out to the tissues, the more effectively, the longer you're going to be able to go before you fatigue those fast twitch fibers that are the fast twitch oxidative fibers. The more oxygen you get there, the longer they're going to be able to go. And that's kind of your ideal middle distance muscle type there. Well, in order to do that, you need to be able to breathe more deeply. You need to be able to have a larger lung capacity. You need to be able to do that more rapidly, and your heart needs to be able to get that out.
Right.
So if you're breathing for an organism that principally has a larger heart and a larger lung capacity, you're going to be able to get that out to those muscles better. So it's not just strictly muscle and bone. There's a lot that goes into the organ anatomy as well.
Sure.
Particularly the lungs.
Yeah. Kind of all works together as a system, huh?
Yeah, it's strange how it works, huh?
Now, and then there's, you're talking about oxygen, the muscles, there's lactic acid. So you need something to get rid of the lactic acid or prevent that buildup or get that out. And I was, as researching for the show, I came across something called milkshaking. I don't know if you've ever heard of this.
Can't say I have.
I guess they put some sort of alkaline solution into the stomach of the horse. They force it in some sort of, like baking soda, I guess would fit that. And, to try to counteract the lactic acid buildup. So one question was, would that even work? And what would be, some of the consequences to the organism if you were doing that, if it's not just like forcing it somehow to absorb the lactic acid?
So like you said, two questions there. The first is, would it even work? The answer to that is no.
Okay.
Our bodies and horses' bodies as well are pretty well adapted that our blood has buffers in it that keep the pH pretty constant. And the principle would be put an alkaline solution in there to make it more basic in the muscles. So then as acid builds up, before it actually becomes acidic, it's got to pass through a neutral, normal stage, and you're staving off that muscle fatigue in principle. The problem is our blood's going to buffer that alkaline solution long before it gets to the muscles,
right,
for the most part.
But now what if you injected it directly into the muscles?
If you inject it directly into the muscles, now you're standing more of a chance of it doing something temporarily.
Yeah.
It's going to be a short-lived thing.
Sure.
But that's also going to inherently cause damage in and of itself. I mean, you're setting off the basic biochemistry of the muscle, just like you are if you're putting it into the stomach.
Yeah.
You're altering the biochemistry. You're altering how efficiently digestion's occurring. You're altering how efficiently oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to be transferred through the blood. So you're playing a dangerous game when you start trying to change the pH of a system that's meant to work at a very specific pH range.
Right. So I guess part of the question then, is if they were, I don't know enough about this practice. I know very little. The article that I read was an accusation against someone having done this, and they described it as force feeding it through the mouth. So it sounds like that's, not very effective, of a plan, but maybe injecting it into the muscles could be, although with some severe risk. But if you're talking about a race that's 2 minutes, maybe that is it short? Is the time frame, and I know this may not be a fair question, so feel free to say, I'm not enough of an expert in specifically horses, but with that 2 minute race, if you injected it right before the race, would that be effective? Would it have time to get into the muscles by the time the lactic acid started to build up in the horse? And so it wouldn't kick in until well after the race? Or would it kick in too soon, or would it be just in the right time zone?
like you said, definitely not my area of expertise. My basic understanding of the physiology and the chemistry is potentially, if I inject something into an environment and then change the pH of that environment, it could have a potential impact. It's also potentially going to cause all sorts of cellular damage because basically the acids that are being produced interacting with the bases that you've put in there, you're going to have acid-base reactions going off inside the blood,
and if I remember from chemistry, that's not usually a good thing
in a confined space. No. I mean, imagine taking the baking soda and vinegar that you mixed together in the volcano in third grade,
right. That's going on in your muscles.
Science, and that's going on inside your muscles. Yeah. Never mind all the, free radicals and things that you're then releasing that can cause damage to the cells.
Right.
But if your goal is to win 3 races over a 1-month period and then get millions of dollars of stud fees for the rest of the life of the animal,
right.
There's a major ethical issue with that.
Yes.
But there's also a monetary reason to try to do that potentially.
Right. And that's sort of where I was trying to go with that because, one is okay, is such a thing, even an effective plan, and then analyze what the ethical issues are. Now, of course, those ethical issues are raised even if you're doing something that's not effective. Right. So if you're a trainer or someone who's got no scruples about this and you're just trying to win the races and you're doing whatever, right? And we as part of our preparation for the show, we were looking at you have the article, right?
Yes.
Let me give the reference to it. So it's an article from the journal Sports and History from March 2012, an article by John Gleaves called Enhancing the Odds, Horse Racing, Gambling, and the First Anti-Doping Movement in Sport, 1889 to 1911. And so in there, he talks about some of the stuff that they were doing in the late 19th century, strychnine and cocaine and, other amphetamines and other stuff too, and then stuff to slow down the horses too. And so all kinds of stuff that, it probably didn't work one way or the other, at least in terms of working towards making the animal faster or slower.
Right.
Depending on what you wanted. And of course the horse is not likely to have a placebo effect.
No.
Although I guess that, the trainers could and the jockeys could, and they could think, okay, the horse is going to be faster, and then ride it like it's going to be faster, and so that you could sort of transfer maybe the placebo effect to the horse. I don't know. That's farther outside my expertise, but
that makes sense. You drive the horse harder because you think it's going to work more effectively, and so by result, it does work more effectively because you've driven it harder.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that happening. And so where was I going with that? Right. So the unscrupulous, so it might not work. Right, some of these techniques, but that doesn't remove the moral question, particularly if you're doing a lot of. So there's two moral issues there, really. One is the welfare of the animal and the rightness or wrongness or the appropriateness of taking into account the welfare of the animal and the harm that's being done to the animal. What kind of moral questions are raised by that? But then also one of the other issues, certainly raised by Gleaves in his paper, is the effect it had on the fair competition, which was important in horse racing as it is in other sports, but particularly horse racing because of gambling.
Right.
And I thought that was an interesting point that he raises in his paper about the role of gambling. So that's another ethical issue, is making sure that it's somehow at least the appearance of being fair. But I want to stick with the health issue, because there are hundreds of horses that die every year. And most of those are, I guess, within the context of the racing. The statistic, I guess, that I see reported in a couple places is 1.5 horses die out of 1,000 starts. So for every 1,000 races, there's 1.5 horses in the U.S. that die. I'm not sure if that's including horses that die during training. Dying on the track, dying afterwards because of an injury or something.
Right.
So it doesn't, as far as I can tell, it didn't break it down by that. But that's a lot of horses.
Oh, absolutely.
And it is higher in the U.S. apparently than some other places to various studies. And, so that's certainly a concern. If we're looking at other kinds of sports, and you had that kind of rate of death, in the human sports, one would imagine that wouldn't be, a sport that stuck around very long.
I can't imagine, yeah.
Although we say that, and it'd be interesting to actually look at the statistics. I mean, how many, particularly in terms of what that includes.
Right.
If that's just 1.5 horses die during the race, then yeah, there's been so few deaths during a competition that there's almost no statistics on that. But if you start including deaths that can be attributed to having played the game, so you talk about the concussion injuries and people have taken their own lives or died early because of that, died during training and so on, then that number is going to creep up. And you wonder, okay, well, what would be the comparable statistic of 1,000 NFL games? How many players die in ways that are connected to
somehow connected to the game?
No, that's obviously a lot. That's a hard statistic to try to figure out what's really connected, right?
There'll be a lot of arguing from certain bodies as to whether or not that should be connected or not.
Yeah, and I think it's a legitimate question in terms of the concussion injuries and how far out you're going to count a death. I mean, if it's someone who's dying, takes their lives 20 years, 25 years after they've played football, and it can be attributed to damage from their concussion, that's still 20, 25 years after the fact. I don't know how much you really want to contribute. How much can that count towards that or not? I mean, and then there's also talk of certain genetic dispositions for CTE and so on, and certain, and so, that's a whole other show.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely.
But I think it would be interesting to see that as a comparison. But, just anecdotally, it does feel like, you hear about horses dying and I know just a few years ago there was, they spent millions of dollars trying to rehabilitate the horse.
Right.
Do you remember the name of that horse? I can't remember. It just popped into my head, so I would have looked it up beforehand. And I know they spent a lot of money, but oftentimes a horse breaks his or her leg on the track and that's it.
Right.
Now, why is that? I mean, again, I know that you're not a veterinarian or something like that, but, just given your understanding of mammalian, it's a hard word to say, mammalian biology, is there a particular reason why horses, a broken leg is a fatal injury for a horse?
Wow. Okay.
Sorry.
No.
I didn't. I would have given you a heads up on that question, but I just
not at
thought
all. Anytime you lengthen over, the course a few million years, an appendage the way it has been and modify it as much as you have, horse, down to the point where you basically have a single bone that's really, really elongated and running through a region of the forelimb or the hind limb. Damage to it is going to be A, difficult to repair, and B, when you've got a four-legged animal with really, really thin legs, removal of any one of those limbs, the compensation from the other limbs isn't going to be there nearly as effectively. I mean, a dog breaks a leg, and it's got three other legs that have a pretty wide surface area to distribute that extra weight across.
Yeah, I mean, you see three-legged dogs
right.
at the pound and stuff.
Take a horse, though, and think about it. Instead of spreading that weight over 4 paws, each with 4 digits on them, you're essentially spreading that weight over 4 toes. Remove a toe, and you're putting a lot more weight on the other 3 toes, relatively speaking, than if you had 3 full paws to spread that across. And so the healing becomes a big issue. The recurrent injury is much more of a major issue of getting them to stay off of it without damaging the rest of their body is very hard. There's complex harnesses that go into this most of the time.
Yeah, I remember seeing the name of that horse is on the tip of my tongue.
It's killing me too, because it's right in my head.
And I know, and the story ended tragically.
Yes.
It didn't play out well. But I remember seeing pictures and they had this big harness and to try to allow the horse to be upright but not putting the weight down. And so, yeah, it's tragic.
And then you've got the distance issue of you're trying to get blood supply down a very, very long limb to an area that's trying to heal.
Right.
And that's going to be compromised because of how thin that area is.
Right.
So now you're dealing with issues of infection, nerve damage, blood supply issues. And if it comes to the point where the infection sets in or the animal's going to lose the limb, a horse can't survive with 3 legs. It's not like a dog. There's not enough area on the other 3 limbs to compensate for it. 3-legged horse is a dead horse. So how far do you go before you say it's time to put it down?
And there wouldn't be prosthetic devices. I mean, obviously, you wouldn't be able to race.
Right.
But what are sort of prosthetics or artificial limbs in some way to keep it alive for the sake of the horse, but also, possibly for studying reasons and so on. I don't know.
And that's horse prosthesis is definitely beyond my scope.
I have no idea. I mean, it'd be interesting if anyone listening knows anything about that. Drop us a line at sportsethicist@gmail.com. I mean, because one of the concerns. So there's one concern that's just generally like it's just too dangerous for the horse, and the concerns that are raised there. I think the horse racing industry has tried very hard to rehabilitate that image.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly I think most trainers and most breeders, care about these animals and they take good care of them. As far as you can tell, I'm sure there's some unscrupulous people on the side and so on. But, there is this perception of sort of disposable horses. Okay, well, this one he didn't win. Bang, let's move on to the next one, which is disturbing. And I mean, trying to think of kind of where to go with that.
Well, and I don't know how much of that is truly a contemporary issue or how much of it is a holdover from this time period that's referenced in this paper and certainly thereafter, the late 1800s, early 1900s, where we got terms like glue factory when it came to horses.
Yeah.
And how much of it is a holdover from a time where that's not really as much of an issue anymore and it's the exception instead of the rule now? And maybe how much of it was the exception instead of the rule in the first place, but it was more highly publicized. Because I don't feel like that's really that may still be the stereotype, but I don't feel like that's actually the condition of horse racing by any means in the 21st century.
Certainly at the reputable tracks and the reputable breeders and stuff like that. I mean, I think that they take great lengths to take care of these animals. Because the people who are doing this, raising the animals, training the animals, they have a love for horses. I would, I'm sure some of them are just in it, because they like the thrill of the chase or for gambling and for, business reasons. And those aren't mutually exclusive. But, I mean, I think you would choose this industry because you care about horses or you admire them and they're beautiful animals. And so it would be shocking that they would view, the animals with such, disposability.
Right.
Acknowledging that some do. Right.
Absolutely.
And that's just a fact of life, I guess, that some people view other humans that way. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's, you're going to come across that view. It doesn't justify it. But yeah, I think you're right. To some extent, it's a holdover from a time maybe when people weren't as caring, or not that they didn't care, but, that the concern about animal welfare wasn't as paramount. And whereas today, I think people, you don't have to be an animal rights activist. You don't have to even think that animals have rights or anything like that to think that there's some sort of moral, relationship that we have to animals in terms of taking care of them, at least when they're in our care and so on, and maintaining safe and healthy environments for them and so on.
Absolutely. And we've definitely come, in my perspective, away from the concept of animals as property to more towards animals as at least recognize them as other living things, and we should care about other living things, if not to the opposite extreme of possibly should animals have the same rights as people, which certainly some people advocate for, but to at least we see in our own lives, we don't see our pets as property. We see them as members of the family in many regards. And we tend to, amplify that out beyond our own animals to other animals we see as well, as long as they're not threatening our existence.
Right, or chewing up our leaves or chewing up our bushes in our yard or something.
Right.
And I think that's right, and I think that is something that is a change. I mean, I think if you talk to old timers or something like that, animals were work animals. They were food. And things like that. They weren't, not that they didn't see them as living beings or respect them or even, go out of the way to avoid, unduly harming or being cruel, which I think is a whole other separate category. But I think the view of animals as part of the family, that, I think that's a relatively contemporary phenomenon, maybe the last 50, 60 years.
I would imagine, although I know nothing on this for sure, and I'm not a sociologist by any means, but I would imagine urbanization and suburbanization of America could be probably pretty closely tied with that. The animal goes from being the outside the house thing to an inside the house thing.
No, that certainly has to have an effect. The fact that it's not just something that's out in the barn,
right?
But that it's sleeping in your bed with you, right. and that kind of level of acceptance is probably it's going to be hard to just view it then as another piece of furniture.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. No, and I think overall that's probably a good thing. I mean, I don't believe in animal rights, but I do think that animal welfare is an important concern for any moral being.
I'd agree with you on that.
And so certainly safety is something that comes up a lot, just in terms of the very process of the race itself and then the care of the horses. And certainly I hope as we've been talking that we're right about that. And my sense is that we are. With some acknowledged exceptions. But one of the other ways in which horse racing might be thought to be unsafe is getting back to some of the issues about the pushing of the body type of the animal, and has that gone to a point that maybe is unsafe for the horse, and then connecting that as well to doping issues, right, in terms of using various kinds of substance drugs and whatnot to try to push it even further. And then, the genetic manipulation, right? Instead of just using artificial selection, just taking control of that more directly, I guess. So, which should we start with there?
You've given me about 14 different pathways I could go on. I mean, I certainly think that, we touched on the time of these races, the winning times of these races, and this certainly goes into this artificial selection question of selecting for the ideal body type, so to speak. And the lengthening and the thinning out of these limbs that has likely occurred along this time period when this has happened, I think lends itself to increase in injury to some extent. The more narrow the limb and the longer the limb, the more likely it is to break.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of that you can easily tease apart looking at literature or statistics, because, as we've said, there's been this kind of shift in the horse racing industry away from maybe some more unscrupulous activities with regards to breeding and care of the horses towards better care, but also better selection for the ideal horse. And so I don't know if necessarily there's been a big change in the number of deaths over the last 150, 200 years.
Yeah, that'd be a good question.
But it would be, what's the cause of those? I would say now it's probably more related to anatomy. The anatomy is now at a certain ideal point for racing that may be sub-ideal for the horse itself. Long, thin limbs, at some point, there's an increased risk of breakage, especially when you're pushing them for a long period of time.
Which comes back to that theme that we've talked about a number of times, the concept of fitness.
Right.
And the athletics. The elite athlete, when we're talking about human beings, the elite athlete and what's required for their fitness versus, the non-elite athlete or just, normal person, and what's required for their fitness, that those aren't necessarily equal,
by any
the same,
means, right,
or synonymous. Whatever the appropriate term would be there. And then similarly with horses, right? I would imagine that there's a fitness for it to be, a wild horse. There's a fitness for it to be your sort of normal domestic horse, which goes out on, little trail rides or something, or a working horse which you don't really have that in these days, except maybe in Pennsylvania, right? Pulling carts and so on. And then horse racing. So there's probably different levels of fitness there. So.
And I mean, if you look at David Epstein's work in humans and looking at the different ideal body types for different sports.
Yeah.
You could certainly look at that in horses as well, and not necessarily for different sports, but for different functions.
Mm-hmm.
Your cart horse versus your horse that's working as a plow horse versus your riding horse versus your thoroughbred racing horse have very, very different body types.
Right.
I mean, there are some horses that I will stand next to them and I'm about at their shoulder. Then there are some horses where I could put my kids standing on my shoulders and they're still not going to be at the horse's shoulder. Those are going to be more your, plow horses, your big Belgians and Clydesdales and things like that.
Right.
So there's
Pull the beer trucks.
Yeah. So there's ideal body types for different horses, and that's been bred depending on what their function is over the course of, human history. I won't even say recent human history, over human history. And race horses are just one aspect of
But
that.
it sounds like even, based on the numbers at least, that you presented there, about the times, and how it sort of flattened out.
Mm-hmm.
You had some increase and then it flattens out. You might wonder how that increase happened. Some of it might be breeding, some of it might be some of the other things we're talking about. But that you have a similar or parallel type of what does Epstein call it? The Big Bang of body types?
Right.
Yeah. So the Big Bang of body, well, do you remember, can you describe it or you want me to try to describe it?
Go right ahead.
Okay. So the Big Bang of body types is, I guess, I don't remember the dates of when Epstein gives it, but he talks about how, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a sense that the best athlete was one that was sort of your average body type.
Right.
And that you couldn't really tell that much of a difference between a shot putter and a track and someone who's running track or something, that they could be from the same, they could be the same athlete.
Right.
Whereas nowadays, they look very different. If you look, and it's got a great little TED video, which I'll put up a link to, where he has a picture of a long distance runner and Michael Phelps and how different their body type is, and yet they wear the same pants because their leg lengths, their legs are the same length, even though Phelps is a lot taller.
Phelps is like close to a half a foot or more taller, but his weight length is all in his torso. The distance runner's length is all in their legs because of different mechanics needed for the different sports.
Exactly. And so the Big Bang there is that the elite athletes, given their particular sports, have developed these phenotypes that are very different across the board. And so to the point that he says you could even correlate just looking at the body types, and you have a reasonably good, if you know what you're doing, a reasonably good chance just looking at the body types of guessing which, and I think I mentioned this on the show before, guessing which sport they play based on their body. So you could see someone with the body type of a long distance runner, and you know that they're running long distance. They're not swimming or shot putting.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So,
I mean, with humans, I would at least hope that we have not gone to the point of breeding for that ideal body type. It's more that it's being selected from the population of this individual is ideal for this sort of sport. Whereas with horses, we've specifically bred for this ideal body type. And I think now that ideal body type has principally, according to what the numbers I'm looking at are, been reached since about 1950 or so.
That's pretty amazing.
Now, we can't anatomically get to the next level simply through breeding, so what are the other ways of doing it?
I guess one caveat might be important to note on that, right? I mean, because you were looking at the three main races in the Triple Crown, the Kentucky, the Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont. There are lots of other races throughout the world. And so that's a small sample type. It's a pretty good draw, I think, in terms of looking at a sample, because it's the main races in the U.S. And so it's, if you're going to see that, I think you would see it there at the, Suffolk Downs in Boston or whatever, Arlington over here in Chicago, which, those aren't low end tracks, but they're not, it's not the Pimlico. Plymouth, yeah, I can never say that. Right. And so it's you probably see more variation there because it's at a lower end. Whereas this would be, these are the elite races.
Right. These are the elite races. These are the elite horses, but they're also generally the elite male horses within a certain age range.
Right.
So there is definitely selection for not just a specific body type, but a specific subset of the population that we're looking at here.
So I just wanted to raise that as a possible caveat, that this is not, exhaustive of the evidence for it. I think it's very suggestive.
Right.
And so it's not, we haven't proved with that beyond a shadow of any kind of doubt here.
No,
I know you're not intending it as such.
No, but. I mean, yeah, where I'm from in New York, we originally, I literally 5 minutes from Belmont Stakes, but we're also not far from Westchester Raceway and Saratoga Springs, and very different types of races happen at different places and different types of horses are racing. This is a very, very small subset of the racehorse population we're looking at here.
Right. And so, but it does seem, there's one explanation of the flatness, is that the body type has reached a certain point. I guess another explanation might be that, the horse racing, was, as Gleaves talks about in his article, was one of the first, if not the first, major sporting association industry to tackle doping. And they first started passing bylaws against various kinds of doping of the horses in the late 1890s into the early part of the 20th century, whereas Human Amateur Athletic Association and so on, that's not the name of it, but humans, and then the IAAF and other subsequent groups didn't really start until the 1930s, I guess, according to the article. So they were well ahead of the ball there, curve or whatever you call it.
On the ball ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I know. I'm mixing my metaphors there. And so one explanation might be that by the 1950s, the testing that was being done, the education that was being done might have reached a critical mass that allowed them to monitor doping very well.
Right.
And that they've kept a handle on it. And so, that combined with the breeding and reaching of a certain phenotype, ideal.
Right.
Whatever you want to call it, that has led to that stability in the numbers. Cause there is a buildup at least in I think it was the Derby you said had the big buildup, right? And so it might be that's part of that's part of the story as well. That it took them a while to get doping under control, and now it's under control. Assuming it is. These are all empirical questions that I'm not. I don't have the answers to directly, but
right. And at the same time, we're also giving short shrift here to horse trainers and veterinarians and jockeys who all play a very key role in the development and
keeping the horses healthy and training them well. Right. Proper training techniques.
Completely ignoring all of that right now, and I fully admit that. But from a biological perspective, you've got two things there of, has doping really been removed from the scenario because it's been regulated for so long, and then at the same time, there's breeding for this ideal body type of winners. You pay for a winner to breed with a female horse to produce horses more likely to win down the line.
Right.
That's where the big money comes from in horse racing, is the stud fees afterwards, not necessarily in the actual winning of the races in and of themselves.
Well, some of these races are pretty big.
Well, yes.
Yeah. So,
long-term potential.
Sure.
Your long-term potential is very, very small with a racehorse when it comes to, you're running the Derby once. You're not running the Derby 4 or 5 or 6 times.
Yeah.
But you've got a lifetime of stud fees if you win the Derby. Not to say that the Derby doesn't provide a lot of money in and of itself if you win it.
Well, you don't even need to win it. I imagine, who came in second or third. Even fourth, I would think. Wicked Strong, I think, came in fourth. He was the horse I was pulling for.
I can't imagine why.
I don't know. Maybe it's this connection to Boston. I don't know. Wicked Strong. And so I imagine a horse that's very successful in the race it won't garner as much, I would imagine.
But there's certainly going to be, if you're a good enough horse to race in the Derby or the Preakness or Belmont Stakes to begin with, you're going to be sought after. After the fact. And there's certainly going to be some sort of a pot coming out of it, winning it. It's not going to be the 1.5 million that the Preakness is this year to win.
Yeah.
But I imagine to place or show, there's a pretty decent amount of money that comes along with that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think so. And then the gambling, that's a big part of it too. I'm sure people gamble on their own horses for sure. And now we mentioned gambling. I think that was one of the interesting things from Gleaves's article was why there was a concern with doping in horse racing 30, 40 years before there was a concern in human sports. You would have thought it was the reverse.
Right.
Just sort of intuitively, like, oh, we care about human beings. And back in the barbaric 1890s, they didn't care about animals. They just, speaking facetiously. And, as he talks about it, it wasn't really about the safety of the animals.
Right.
But about the fairness of the competition for the sake of betting and gambling, and that the view was, as he argues, that the reason why these weren't so much of a concern for humans was because the idea was, well, look, if humans are doping, they're doing it to get better,
Right.
and that they were still going to compete hard, and that a human doesn't need to dope to throw the race, right? They can just run slow, right? The horse is just going to run. Right. And so the horse isn't going to say, okay, I'm going to run slow today. Right. I mean, I guess the jockey could hold it back, but, but that's bad for the jockey in a way, and it's bad for the human athlete. And so the view was that in horses, the concern wasn't so much doping to make the horse faster, that this concern was that the doping was going to be used to manipulate the race, to decide to weaken some horses and to quicken other horses. And so to prevent the fixing of the races, the anti-doping was a concern out of that, and that doesn't come, and it wasn't until later that humans, that a different concern arises about the safety for humans. Excuse me, the concern about artificiality of the running of the races. If you think that, doping and the like creates a kind of artificiality in performance, and, that those come later. This concern about it's unnatural, right? That these are later concerns that come in, and that's not really what it was about in horse racing. It was more about the competition.
Right. I mean, many times, like with many other things, the first concern was an economic concern.
Yeah.
It was, how's it going to affect my bottom line? If it's not fair, then I can't fairly place a bet and know what I'm going to get. So now here's this set of, here's the things you should look for before you bet on a horse. Is it showing any of these signs? Because if it is, it might be doped and you shouldn't bet on it.
Yeah.
Followed by, okay, now here's these rules to prevent this from happening. Now how long does it take before those rules are being effectively enforced? Because really, it's a money-making scenario, and if you're going to affect the bottom line of the people involved in it, now you're causing a problem. It's not necessarily the health of the horse that we care about here. Mm-hmm. It's the financial gains or lack thereof related to the gambling. Yeah. And like you said, later on down the line, we start to realize, okay, performance enhancement in humans, there's a fairness element to it, but there's also a health-related and a safety-related element to it that comes into concern. And so
right. Which I think is also a concern for horses today as well. I think that's one, if you talk to just sort of man on the street, so to speak, I think that why is doping not allowed in horse racing? I think I think it's bad for the horse. I think that would be certainly one of their top 3 answers.
And I think that might be one of the top reasons now, but that definitely, as this points out, and I think it fairly states, that wasn't the reason that it became a concern in the first place.
Right. And I think that's pretty interesting. And the idea of getting rid of it to try to create these equal conditions and to make sure that, at the very least, there was an appearance of it. But like in human doping world, I'm sure the dopers tend to stay ahead of the testers. There's lots of reports all the time. If you look into the sort of horse racing, you just start read the news about it. There's always accusations about this, that, or this technique, this milkshaking technique, other ways of people trying to skirt around this, and then there's, just like with humans, right? There's what we might say or might call legitimate drugs, therapy, where someone needs it. So they need Adderall just for the prescription label things that you would have Adderall for. HDH, I guess, is one of the things there. But then it's also a stimulant, and so it can also be used in that way. And so there's, you have a football player who has ADHD, he's taking Adderall for that, but it also has this other effect. And so there's similar things in horse racing too, where
absolutely.
They might be taking certain medicines for therapeutic reasons, but that they do have also an enhancing effect. And same within humans, how do you fairly adjudicate that? Right. And that's I think one of the questions that comes up within just in general in the doping question. And then and then that's related to questions just about the legitimacy of any of these records and horse times and so on.
Right.
The races and whether or not doping undermines those or not. Well, I did want to, we have 5 minutes or so. So I did want to touch on genetic manipulation.
Okay.
Cause, that does seem to be, across all these doping questions, that's the next front, right?
Absolutely.
That is coming, if not already here. And so raises a lot of questions. So, what could the next step be if you were trying to genetically manipulate a horse? What would it be to try to get beyond these numbers, assuming that everything we've said about that we've reached this sort of peak, all right, horse peakness. That's bad. That's a bad phrase. Scratch that. All right. So whatever it might be, I was trying to think of like peak oil or something. I don't know, like peak horseness, right? What would be the thing that might break that boundary? What could they do? Would it be something with the foot? Would it be something with the legs? Would it be strengthening of the bone in some way? Would you have any sense of that?
I think it could be actually any number of different things. I mean, ranging from, do you manipulate the horse in some way to cause an increased length in the leg, more so than it's naturally producing? Can you somehow genetically manipulate it to make it longer, or make it longer while simultaneously making it strong enough to withstand that increase in length? Mm-hmm. Can you, do what we've done in mice and create, not to the same extent, but a Schwarzenegger horse where you can increase the production of things like insulin-like growth factor or other developmental proteins that are going to trigger increased production of certain types of muscle fibers more so than the animal is physically capable of developing on its own. Mm-hmm. And so I would say genetic manipulation could potentially go towards increased length of the limb while also strengthening it, because it really can't get much longer than it is now without it being a toothpick.
Right.
Increased muscle mass of specific muscle types, or increased respiratory capacity. Can you create a larger lung, or can you create an organism that produces naturally more erythropoietin, for example, that's going to give you more red blood cell production, that's going to allow it to transport oxygen more effectively.
Right. EPO.
Right.
Yeah.
If you can do that, then you have an organism that can run more effectively for longer periods of time. You're not going to get, you're either not going to get a late race fall off, or instead of having to wait till later in the race to get to
do the push.
The push, you can push right from the start if you've got a horse that can effectively transport oxygen better for longer periods of time. The scary thing about genetic manipulation in athletic performance is that the options are so numerous and so abundant. I could probably pick a dozen different things to try to target on, and any one of them may in some way enhance the athletic ability of that organism, be it a horse or a human.
Right. It could, and then the question that comes following up on that, of course, is what's the trade-off? Because it does seem like there's always going to be a trade-off.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And so if you're, as you were talking about, increasing the length of the limb would make it faster, but it's also likely to make it going to snap.
Exactly.
Quite quickly. And, so that's going to seem the trade-off, right? So what kind of trade-offs are there in any one of those? And I'm not asking you to give me those, but so one, there does seem like there would be biological trade-offs that could make it more susceptible to other kinds of harms. So you're increasing one thing, that means you got to turn down because you can't just turn them all to 11, right? It seems like to do that, you're going to have to turn down some of the other dials.
Absolutely.
That's a bad metaphor, but it
makes
works
sense.
to the extent that just to get the point across. And then the other side of that, not so much maybe in horse racing, but certainly within humans, is how do you test for this without massive violations of privacy?
Right. Exactly.
Because it's basically the only way you have to have people's genomes and their parents' genomes and look for that kind of manipulation that you would, any kind of evidence for that. And that seems to be, a pretty drastic invasion into a person's privacy now maybe you can get around that because of informed consent and whatnot, but it still seems as a big issue in terms of that. Now I think that's probably less in horses because, the horse doesn't necessarily have privacy concerns or interests or rights in that respect.
Although, if animals, at least in the U.S., are still generally considered property of their owner, then you're getting into privacy concerns of the owners.
Right. I was going to say that the owner of the horse might have patent on that and doesn't want that to be subject to any. Well, I guess it's a patent. You don't need to worry about it because. But if you had proprietary, you didn't want to patent it, and you just wanted to keep it secret and proprietary. But then it's being exposed to this kind of testing, then that would seem problematic. And so, yeah, there could be concerns there. Again, I think you can get around some of that with informed consent. Look, if this is what you want to do, you want to participate with us. These are some of the conditions, assuming that those conditions aren't in themselves, totally unreasonable. So that those are the next frontier. And it does seem like, there's a whole host of questions that get raised by that.
Right. How do I turn around and moving away from horses for a second? How do I go to a baseball player, draw blood, and say, your testosterone levels are high, you're doping, and they demonstrate they're not doping, they just produce an abnormally high amount of testosterone. How do I demonstrate that that's not natural, as opposed to that's either natural or that's genetically manipulated without going in and getting parental genomes and their genome and all these other things? And then if it's the parents that have done it, all right, I mean, it's not necessarily the responsibility of the player himself or herself, right? If it's a choice that their parents made, they can't be, that raises a question. Should they be responsible for that? And if it's something that can occur naturally in the process of reproduction or whatever you call it, just sort of normal genetic processes, then, why would that really be objectionable from a fairness standpoint? Those are the questions that get raised in the literature, right? Oh, absolutely.
And, and out in the public too. Connected to that, lost the thought. Maybe when that happens, it was right there. It's gone. Probably come back in about 5 minutes when the show's over. No, I see. Came back, right?
Oh, good.
So, I might edit that out. Then you cross over into chimeras or chimeras, however you pronounce that, where you start bringing in other genomes, right? So for horses, like to get what you're looking for, maybe the longer but stronger limb, do you go out to some other animal that might have that gene or not that complex of genes that would help to do that? Or at least influence that in some way. And does that cross a line when you start moving outside of the genome of this particular species? And where do you draw the line? And so those are all fascinating.
Whole slew of questions and things that don't necessarily really have good answers right now.
Yeah, because in some ways you're talking science fiction a little bit. I mean, it's science fiction that is not, you're not talking about like travel by light speed or anything, or lightsabers, that kind of science fiction. But it's science fiction in the sense that we can't quite do all of it yet, but it's in theory possible.
Oh, yes.
And it's just more a technological problem of figuring some of this out, and someone's going to figure it out. Someone's going to do it. And then it does seem like the kind of thing that we're going to answer the question after it's already been done, and that by that point it may be too late.
Seems like that's often the case.
Yeah.
We answer the question we had no choice but to answer the question because it's been done already.
Right.
It's not, is this moral? It's, was this moral?
Was this moral? What do we do about now? And can we get the horses back in the barn, right? To bring it back to horse racing. So cool. Any other comments on horse racing?
No, I'm good.
How do you feel about the Yankees?
Yeah.
No, they're doing all right.
They're doing
above
pretty
500,
well.
right?
They're doing pretty well. They're keeping pace in their division. No big issues there. I'm just happy to see the decision to retire Torres' number.
No, that's good. I respect that.
We're running out of numbers quickly at this point.
I know.
Time.
They're gonna have like now playing for the Yankees. Frank Smith, number pi. That was stupid. All right.
I came from a Boston fan.
Hey, we're above 500 now. Well, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me again.
This has been the Sports Ethicist Show. You can find us at sportsethicist.com, Facebook, and Twitter, and you can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.